fooling with my screen here. Does the Rav hear me?
I hear you. I see you. You're looking beautiful.
Beautiful. I wish I could feel beautiful, but how can anybody feel beautiful these days? This is
Lulei Tayrascha Shashui Azovadati Beonyi. Without the
there was
simcha,
never
the
a
Torah
terrorist
Kedusha.
attack. Amen. There was never a terrorist attack. This is an unbelievable statistic. There has not been a terrorist attack in Bnei Brak. Medina. It's the only city in Eretz Yisrael that there was no terrorist attack. As we all know.
When Chaim was nifter last week, it was not just the Levaya of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. It was the Levaya of the Chazaynish. It was the Hemshich of the Chazaynish. It doesn't mean that we don't have Shmira. It means we have to now take up the slack and on our own. We have to have our own Schlusat Torah. So it has to be a wake-up call. Like Almin Yisrael. A wake-up call, yeah. But now we have the wake-up call. Till now we knew it. Now we see it. Pshutai mamish. So they helping. But Lulei Tayrascha Shashui, and the Torah is Ein Shmira Kat Torah. So the einzige Shmira is Torah Kedusha. That's the einzige Shmira. So what we do. So
okay.
The sugi of matzahs, the shein matzahs mitzvah. I wanted today. This is Gederech Shel Aguda. You guys are just no games. You want not to learn. Once we're learning Hilchos Pesach, so normal people learn Bedika, Leil HaSeder, maybe Ich weiß. We'll talk a little bit about maybe Agolas Kalim. No, over here we go right for the most schwer, difficult sugya of Gans Masechta Pesachim, the Gans Halachas, which is the sugya of the matzah. And let's try. What we're going to try to do is a little bit the sugya, and then I want to try to go into the matzah bakery and try to bring out the chumras and what's a chumra and what's not a chumra and what's lemaisa. I'll try a little bit to stel this avek. An interesting shaila that I received. Somebody told me that he recently went to a machine matzah factory, and I won't today discuss the shaila of the machine matzahs with the lishma and that sugya. Okay, that's its own sugya. But somebody told me that he went to a machine matzah factory to see what's going on, and he said it was a machine matzah factory which had a wonderful hechsher, and he said he saw things that he couldn't believe. He sees a matzah, and a matzah is sitting there on a conveyor belt, and it's not being worked on, and he says l'chayra, it's all treif. L'chayra, it's all treif. That was his kasha. But as Hashem, we'll come back to it, and we'll try to be melabin the dvarim, understand the dvarim, understand what's a chumrah, what's not a chumrah. Avada in Pesach, all chumras are accepted. Avada, but to say something is treif and Achenu B'nai Yisrael are eating it, and maybe even some of us that are here right now learning the sugya. So we have to know what's a chumrah and what's medina and what's not medina. And we're going to try. It's a very big sugya. This is really, we're focusing mostly on Siman Tov Nun Tes, which is basically based on a Gemara Daf Mem Beis, based on a Gemara Daf Mem Ches, the Shulchan Aruch based on a Rosh. There's a big sugya here. You could spend days, weeks and weeks and weeks on this sugya. I shouldn't say days and be mezalz on the sugya, but we only have Shalishim Yom Kodim Achag. So let's Be'ez Hashem. Let's get to work. There's a lot of akdomas that are necessary here, and I won't, unfortunately, be able to do them justice. I'll just tell you that we have the Gemara at the end of Parakal Shah, and the Gemara gives us over here a list of seemingly hanhagas to make sure this is the focus of the day. We have to make sure that the dough in front of us is not going to be mischametz. And the Chazal gave us all types of ideas and halachas and pashat an attitude to make sure that which is in front of us won't be mischametz, won't turn into chametz. So, for example, the Gemara, which we won't talk about today, some of them were baking outside and whatnot. Like bia yadam in atarner ache tigmor es hapas. We have here sugyas about baking in the sun. We have here sugyas, all the ein loshin b'makim hashemesh, and there's all different discussions if it's a cloudy day and whatnot. But there's all discussions just to make sure and to go out of your way to make sure that the matzah, what we call the matzah, doesn't turn into chametz, to be working the whole time, to not allow it to be mechametz, to make sure that the room is not going to be hot, which today I'll go into. I heard at the end when I was zeicha, I came on to the end of the year from Reb Shleiman. I heard that the Olam is clearing what's the pshat in the letter of the Chazon Ish, in the 185th letter in the Igris. So the Chazon Ish, one of the things he says is that you're not supposed to have a lot of water. You're supposed to have as little water as possible. Today, generally in the bakeries, they have certain kabbalas and hagas, maybe for the some sefer, a quarter of the amount of the matzah should be water. Okay, all different things. But there is the Chazon Ish said not like this. This shaila I asked once to the Goyin Rechaim Kanievsky, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, that what's the chumrah of the Chazon Ish? What was the nekuda of what the Olam over here was asking? What's the nekuda that should be less water inside the matzah? Just to give you a sagis today, a little bit musagim. So he said, I thought one way. I thought that the reason was simply because you don't want it to be sticky. If there's a lot of water, it'll be sticky and it'll be on your hands. And if it'll be on your hands, then we're going to have problems, which we're going to talk about today. When there's matzah on your, when there's chametz on, when there's dough on your hands, the dough sits there and it grows and grows and grows until you have a bagel. So then the next matzah that you're touching could become this chametz, etc. So I thought that was the chumrah. I asked the question to Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim said that he thinks that the chumrah was, and I guess he knows because he was by the Chazon Ish. He thinks that the chumrah is because when you go into an oven with a very wet matzah, quote unquote, with a lot of water, it's going to take longer to bake. And we want it to bake as fast as possible. You take a matzah, you throw it in the oven, 10 seconds and no more. Because the more it's in the oven, when it's hot, the oven's hot, you're taking this dough and heat rises and makes other things rise. And that's the problem of this chametz. Now, these are chumras. Today, the ikar I want to try to give the item is what's a chumrah, to try to understand what goes on. What does it mean when we say 18-minute matzahs? And what's going on talking with the machine matzah and the new controversy of machine matzah that you're hearing about, that maybe it's totally not kosher because it sits on a conveyor belt and nobody's working on it. So maybe, and it might even be hot in that area of the conveyor belt. So what about that? Let's see over here. We have, for example, just again, to take a step back for a moment. The Torah says, let's like be a yadem and a pass. Don't lift your hands from the dough, then do any other asik. Achitigmor kol pass. When you're making the dough, you shouldn't leave the dough below asik, even for a second. And kolzman that you're oisik, we have a Kabbalah that if you're oisik in the dough all day long, kol hayoim einay machmitz. If you're oisik in the dough all day long and you keep on doing it 20 hours, it's not going to turn into chametz. You are preventing the chametz. But if you leave it, shear mill, if you leave it without a shear, if you don't do asik, shear mill, heavy chametz, then it turns into chametz. And here's where we are introduced to the shear mill. We know there's a whole concept of mill all over the place when it comes to shkia, when it comes to davening. Over here, we're introduced that after a certain amount of time, the mill, which we, Derek Klal say, it's 18 minutes. Today, we'll see the sheetas of 22 and a half minutes that the Mishabura takes very seriously. The sheetas of 24 minutes that the Rambam and the Goyin take very seriously. Some Sefer takes 22 and a half minutes very seriously. Now, upon him, when you leave matzah, when you leave dough for 18 minutes, it seems to be machmitz. So what is this exactly? Comes along the Ran, for example, and Daf Yud Beis and Beis, and the Ran says that Rashi explains that you have to be oisik in the batzei kol shah, like the name of the parak. Comes along the Ran, he says, Leina hira. Imkeina yaloimar, like be a yadam and isa. L'chein nira, that chachamim, don't say yadam and isa, they say pass. So he says, nira shachachamim asra shalei tazik b'dvarim acherim klal. Don't get involved. The Ran says, no. Don't be too machmir over here. Don't be too nervous over here. Not with the nervin. It just means don't get involved in other things while you're being oisik in the matzah, while you're making the dough, because then you'll get carried away. And then you're going to get things get carried away, and you're not going to know the amount of time. But you're allowed to go, leave the dough for a few seconds, even a few minutes, and go and heat up the oven and make sure that the oven is nice and hot and piping that you can put inside the dough. Right? Just make sure that it's not too long, like 18 minutes. This is halacha. is halacha. Don't be oisik in other things, like we find a lot of times in halacha. Don't be oisik in other things, because if you're oisik in other things, you can't focus on one thing. And we want you focused on the dough. Lefi this, kimat everything we're going to talk today, kimat is mutter. You have a piece of dough on the table in the matzah bakery, and you're working with it, and you leave it there until the next guy and the next guy. Don't be oisik in other things. Okay, I'm in a matzah bakery. I'm not going to be oisik in other things. And make sure you don't leave it there for 18 minutes. I don't think anybody's leaving that one piece of dough there for 18 minutes. And kimat, all the shilos that we'll talk about won't be a problem. That's the sheet of the Ran. Maybe if you have a little breckle on the side that came off, which is what goes on in a matzah bakery. So maybe you have to worry that that little breckle has been sitting there and sitting there and sitting there. Okay, so every few minutes, wipe off the table, which bamis, we can make sure that people do. But wipe off the table, because otherwise that little piece of dough is getting bigger and bigger. And after 18 minutes, he becomes a challah, and that'll go into your next dough. But the idea, which you see from the Ran, is that the idea is don't be oisik in other things. The Heilige Rambam, he just says, Leisaniach as ha'itza, v'tisasek b'dover acher. And the Rav Magid, the Magid Mishnah says, Nirashu pirish l'masha amru leisek b'ya yodam etayver, or you have sheshu mishnah. Again, the same idea. Like leisaniach es ha'isa, don't just leave the isa. Leisek b'ya yodam etayver. Okay, maybe the Rambam is being a bit more machmir. The Rambam says no, it doesn't mean like the Ran. Don't oisik in something else. He says don't leave the dough. So now we're getting somewhere. It seems to be now there's a stress on not leaving the dough. The ikar makor for this idea is from the Heilige Rosh. Comes along the Rosh in the Chuvas, and this is a very big Chuva that is quoted all over in Yud Daled, and this is really the makor and basis for the big questions that we're going to ask today on what we're going to talk about. The big problems come from this Rosh. The Rosh is an incredible chumrah. Kol zman she'asukim b'botzek ein ha'machmetz. You should know that when you're oisik in the dough, the whole time you're pressing the dough, it won't become chametz. Aval achashin is asik, but once you were oisik in the dough, v'nischamim tachas yadayim, now your hands are hot, and you're oisik in the dough. Im yanichenu, if you leave it below yasik, miyad yachmetz. And these are the key words of the day. With these words, the Rosh Mamish shook the whole world. He said that a person can be oisik in matzah, chametz, in the matzah all day long, the dough. But regularly leave it, now it's much worse. And we don't have any more 18 minutes. 18 minutes is a concept when you didn't use your hands and heat up the dough. But when you heated up the dough, so now we have a new problem. Now the dough is hot. And once the dough is hot, it's machmet, says the Rosh, immediately. Now, this is a very scary line. And Rabbeinu Yerucham brings this lalacha. And in the Trumas Adeshen, Kufcha Beis, he says, Im Shah Batzek Belim is asking Kashir Hilach Milcha Shvina Leke Chametz. Im Loisha Kashir Azeh, Bepam Echaz El Pamayim. He comes along the Trumas Adeshen with another problem. He says, wait a minute, do we add together when you stop for a second? I stopped for a second. Could I add that together with again stopping for a second? So what do we do? So like we always do, we look in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch will tell me what to do. Comes along the Shulchan Aruch, and it gets even scarier. Comes along the Shulchan Aruch, Tov Nun Tes Siv Beis, Lo Yanichu Aisa B'Layesik. Don't leave the Isa without working on it. Ve'afilu Rega Echad, and even for 1 second. But you should know, Kol Zman Jim is asking by Kol Zman that you're oisik in the Isa and you're working with it. Kol ha'yoyim ein ha'machmetz. It won't become chametz. You got to remember that. V'minichoi b'lo yesek shir mil have a chametz. He says, but if you leave it a shir mil, that's chametz. Okay, what's a shir mil? Revi'as shah. He goes over here. Revi'as shah, chelik esrim min shah, which we know is.
Okay, can I have your permission to put the Mishnah on so everyone can see the mechaber inside? Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay.
Top nun test, Steve base.
Yeah, we have that. Yeah. Okay, keep on going. We'll put it on.
Okay. So the first part of the Shulchan Aruch is understandable. Kolzman I'm being oisik in it, it can never be machmas. Then the Shulchan Aruch tells us the halacha. They should know if you leave a dough for 18 minutes, it can become machmas. And like I said, the amount of time of the mill here, the Shulchan Aruch, L'shitasai, all over the place, Reis Chalif, and all over the place. Reis Gimel, he goes that a mill is 18 minutes and good. Okay. He said, and then the Ramah comes along and says, you should know, you got to be machmir when you're making the matzahs, because you have to worry about, you got to be mamayer in the matzahs. Go fast when you're making the matzahs, because you have to worry about the shehiyas, the time, the intervals that it was by itself. mitzdarif, a minute here, a minute there. So if you leave it and then you go back, and then you leave it and then you go back, so that minute adds to that minute, and we can get up to 18 minutes. And also, cham, you got to be careful. It shouldn't be hot. And the matzah bakeries have all types of klolim about having windows on the top and letting air in and having a certain thermostat and it can't be hot. It can't be that you're baking in a hot place. But here now, the Shulchan Aruch says the earth-shattering line. The question is asku b'batzek. But now that you've been oisik in with the matzah, with the chametz, with the dough, v'nischamin b'yadayim. Till now, we were discussing that the person is being oisik in stam. He's maybe he's stam. He was lushit and he made it into a gibel. But if he's being oisik with his yadayim, he's pressing it with his hands. Your hands heat up the dough. He paskins the rosh. The Shulchan Aruch says that if you have a piece of dough and you were oisik with your hands are hot, and your heat has now gone into the dough. So if you leave it even for a second, miyad yachmitz. So that, Rabbi Isai, is the big line. Now, this line is itself very scary. Let's take a step back for a second, because you have to, when you get a little bit of a saga, what was in the Rishonim, what was in the place before we get to the Rosh and try to understand the Rosh. But I do tell you, Rabbi Isai, I've been in matzah bakeries, and I'll tell you for sure, if this line of the Rosh is kipshutai, then you cannot eat machine matzahs. Because there's no question in the world. Maybe on a hand matzah, everyone's working every single second and whatever, but there's no shaila in the world that on a machine matzah, there are definitely parts on the conveyor belt where no one's working on it. Now, the only thing is that the Shulchan Aruch already is giving away a little bit. He tells us it's only when you're working on it with your hands and your hands heated up. Whereas perhaps on the conveyor belt, on the machine matzahs, perhaps on the conveyor belt, we don't have hands. That's the whole thing. It's interesting. There was a certain matzah chabura, machine matzah, that wanted to have chumras, so they brought in there a bunch of bnei Torah to, be a part of the matzah and to make sure it's clean and etc. And with the lishma, etc. Right? Could be that chumra was maybe kamli de kula, because what they were trying to do, some of them were, as the conveyor belt was going, they were trying to work on it. Until now, it didn't have the hands that were heating it up. That the Rosh comes along and says, when your hands heated up, it's machmitz miyad. But now, when they went and they pressed their hands, they weren't able at certain parts of the conveyor belt to put their hands there. So now you definitely have this problem, the chayr of the Rosh, that once you put your hands there and you start working with the matzah, miyad yachmitz, if you're going to leave it even for a second. But this requires, Rabbi Isai, a little bit of havana. This is not what goes on in the matzah bakeries. This is definitely not what goes on, that in every single second, there are times that a person is waiting to pass. He just played with the matzah, he just worked with the matzah, and now he's waiting to pass it to the next guy. And you see him, he's flipping it up and down on his rolling pin, and he's waiting and waiting. And then you see him, he flips it, and then finally that guy gets it, and he puts it down. It's not miyad. There are times that there's an asik. But there are times that it sits there, and once it had been worked on with the hantalach, so then l'chayra, it should be machmitz miyad. and Rabbi Isai, if you think about it, all of the matzah has been worked on with the hands, because the fanemer, the person, the kneader, he's been working on it with his hands. So we have to try to figure out where this Rosh plays the role of halacha mamish. But let's go back for a step. You have to know that in the sugya, it's vadai that the most, like the Bir Halacha over here, the Bir Halacha in the Ramantzla of Achar is extremely bothered by this. He's bothered that this is definitely not the Minig Olam. The Minig Olam is not like this. And the Bir Halacha goes on right away to remind everyone that there's a Rashba, a Ramban, a Trumas Hadeshen, and the way he learns even the Rambam is that they're vadai chaylik on the Rosh. And we will see in a moment Rayas also from the Maril, because it's very interesting. The Ran himself and many Rishonim, they all had this minig that you just heard of, that they would make the dough, and then afterward, they would heat up the fire to put the matzah in. Now, by side, it takes time to heat up the fire. They'd already made the dough, and it takes time to heat up the oven. And Alpha Pikain says the Ran, that at that point is when you get a mill. So it's barer that they even had a minig like this. There was a minig Rishonim that they would actually, and this is really the Bir Halacha Kimat points out, there was a minig Rishonim that they would make the dough, they would roll it out, etc., with the hands, and then they would afterward heat up the oven. And the whole point was just don't get carried away with something else. And this is a minig that you find the Shelta Gebayrim had this minig, and the Meiri had this minig, and many, many, many Rishonim had this minig. So it took time. And the Bialacha brings us down. So that's borrower that we have time. Number one. Number two, you see already in the Ramah says you got to be careful because if you have times that it has intervals of where you're not being Isaac, the times add together to be a mill. Now, wait a minute. If I was using my hands, so then Avada, you just said a minute ago that it's Machmitz Miyad. So then what am I adding together? Even if I leave it for 1 second, it should be a problem. So again, we're going to see. There's definitely many Mikoiris before the Rosh that there's Rishonim that are discussing Shehiyas and adding them together. That means that to say it's Machmitz Miyad is against a very, most, if not all, Kimat of the Rishonim, like the Bir Alacha points out over here. More so is the Rosh himself, and Daf Mem Chesed Beis, he says first that the shear of the Chimutz is a mill. Now, how that works is a steer in the Rosh, etc. We're going to see in a moment that it's not so pashut. But the Rabbeinu Yeruchim that you just heard, that the Rabbeinu Yeruchim, that's how the Torah brought down, goes with the Rosh. So I'll tell you what's the Rabbeinu Yeruchim that is the Raya that he goes with the Rosh. So the Rabbeinu Yeruchim that the Torah is quoting is referring to a chumrah that you're not supposed to make matzahs with designs on them. And he brings down because of the Rosh. The Rabbeinu Yeruchim, I'll read you his lashon. Because when you're making these designs, he says, what's going to happen when you make these designs? Inevitably, it takes time. The dough sits, and now you're making this nice design, and it takes time. He says, and not only that, even if you're an expert, but because you're an expert, so then you're going to try to make even a nicer design. So even though you work faster maybe than a regular person, but you have your expertise requires you, but they're trying to make something beautiful. So now he says, therefore, you're not allowed to make it because the dough is sitting. Now, how should the Rabbeinu Yeruchim end? He should end with these words. And he's being machmir like the Rosh. He should end with these words. He'd say, and if you did, it's chametz. Because the Rosh just told us that once you worked on it with your hands and you leave it for a second, so then it's machmetz miyad and you don't have the shear mill. The only time you have the shear mill is like we keep on saying, according to the Rosh, that when you taka weren't working on it with the hands, so then you get a mill. But once you worked on it with the hands, so then your hands heated up the dough, and then you only get the second, and it's machmetz immediately. And the Rabbeinu Yeruchim is going with that sheet, and therefore he says, what should you not do? Don't draw on the matzah's fancy sketchings, etchings, etc., because it'll be machmetz miyad. Therefore, it's aser. So how does he end? He should say, and if you did, it's aser. How does Rabbeinu Yeruchim end? He ends with these words. He says, vim over v'asa. But if you did it, and you see that it's not chametz, you're allowed to be yoytze the mitzvah. So it's mefurish. It's mefurish that b'di'eved this is okay. So then, what's the pashut shot according to Rabbeinu Yeruchim? How he learned the Rosh? That when the Rosh said the words machmetz miyad, you can't take the Rosh at face value. And that when the Rosh says it's machmetz miyad, he means it potentially could be machmetz miyad. And you should know, Rabbi saying that this is definitely how many achrayim go. In even the das of the Rosh. It's the emes is, it's very interesting here. The Bir Alacha has many plans in how to figure out what's the pshat in this Rosh. He's so bothered that the Minig Olam is really clearly not like this. This Rosh in Klav Yudalid, the Rabbeinu Yeruchim and Chelik Gimel Nesiv Hey. But like we're saying, Rabbi Say, it's very good. Even the Rosh was just telling you, don't leave it once you work. The Rosh was telling you a chumrah, like we find a lot of times in Pesach and matzahs. Don't work on it with your hands and then leave it, even for a second, don't leave it. Because it's machmetz miyad. What does he mean it's machmetz miyad? He means there's a lot of factors that could be, and potentially it could be machmetz miyad. Do we say, though, that if you did it, it is chametz? Avada not. Like you see in your Rabbeinu Yeruchim. You'll check it. You'll see if it was nichsaf. You'll see if it has some types of cracks in it. You'll see if it looks like it rose, etc. And then you'll determine if it was chametz. I guess, number one, this is the first limitzchos for what goes on in the matzah bakery. Don't leave it for a second, because if you leave it for a second, it's going to be machmetz. Dainu potentially could be machmetz. I guess, we have a Kabbalah, you see what's going on. We're sitting at the table and we don't see these cracks on these doughs. So therefore, even the Lefi the Rosh, it could be that is what to work with. More so, everybody say. More so. It's very interesting. In the Shulchan Aruch over here, I'll read you the Mechaber in Tov Samich. The truth is actually one moment before the Mechaber. I'm going to read you from the Darkei Moishe Orach, the Ramah himself. And the Ramah says, he brings over here from the Katz of a Kolboy, Void HaRav Peretz, Zechron Levracha, Omar Mir Ritzpah. Pasak Kirby, okay, it's a little bit sugidik. He says, Ain oisin, that's all right. Oisin srikin and he says there are certain types of sketches and etches that you're allowed to make in the matzah. Not like I just said from Rabbeinu Yerucham. So the Darkei Moshe when ke'ein rekikin da'az ein lachash lechimas. He says if you're making very thin matzahs, so then you don't have to worry about chimas. And he seems to be there was even a minhag that made srikin. Now, before you go weiter, if you're making some kind of a design in the matzah, you're vadai leaving the matzah for a few seconds. So if we baskin like the Rosh, then this Darkei Moshe, it doesn't make sense. You left it for a few seconds, it's machmetz miyad. So the Darkei Moshe is telling us over here another potential teretz. One teretz we just said is even the Rosh doesn't mean it. When the Rosh says that it's machmetz miyad, the Rosh doesn't mean it's machmetz miyad the second you leave it once you were oisik. He means it could be machmetz. Okay? And that's really Muchach and Rabbeinu Yerucham, who is quoting the Rosh and saying that if you see that it wasn't machmetz, it's good. He just tells you don't do things based upon it. But the Darkei Moshe is introducing us to another teretz. Our matzahs, Rabbi Yisai, are very, very thin, and Kalvachayim the Ashkenazi matzahs are extremely thin, and therefore we're not the same type of matzahs that were being made maybe 1,000 years ago, or maybe even 2,000 years ago, etc. Because our matzahs are extremely, extremely thin. And since our matzahs are extremely thin, so therefore, even when you leave it, the Rosh would never talk about such a matzah. That's what the Darkei Moshe is saying. You're allowed to even make etches and sketches and whatnot into the matzah, which you're probably going to leave. Why? Because they're rekikin dakin. And you should know, everybody side, this teretz of something being extremely thin, and because of it being very thin, therefore we're more mekel, is a teretz that I found afterward that the Or L'Tzion says. Now, it's very important to know the Or L'Tzion in Ched Gimel and Perkid Aleph in Ha'or Hey. It's very important to know that the Or L'Tzion says this, because till now he's telling me the Darkei Moshe says this. And the Darkei Moshe, we assume, had the same matzahs that we have, Ashkenazi. But the Or L'Tzion, whose matzahs were thicker, because he was a Sephardi. Even those matzahs, the Or L'Tzion is saying, are so thin that they're not going to have the problem that they're machmetz miyad when you leave it. So now you have another limitzchos.
What is the pshat, the difference in thin and thick? What's the difference here exactly?
When something is thick, so then the dough itself has much more chimutz potential. You see that all over Masechta Pesachim. When something is thicker, so then it's kanira, that's how it works, right? When something is thin, it has to work to come out. I don't know if it's because it's hot in there. I don't know if that's a reason that therefore it's hotter, or I don't know, maybe it's partially because it's already roast sauce.
So why do the Chazon Ish say less water and thicker dough? That would seem to be counterintuitive.
No, because if you have thinner, I'm sorry, did I not say from Rechaim? Rechaim said that I think I was in the middle of saying, and I stopped in the middle. Rechaim said that the reason why that the Chazon Ish was marked banana water is not like I said, not because that it sticks to your hands, which also could be an issue. Okay, and then you'll have the problem. Rechaim said a different thing. I think I forgot to mention. Rechaim said that the reason why is because when you put it into the oven, when there's less water, it takes longer to bake. When there's more water, it takes longer to bake. When there's less water, then it's going to bake very quickly, because when there's water, you have to dry out the water. So that's a different nakuda. There, the pshat is that the more water, the more problem we're going to have, because if it's going to be hotter in there, so it has more time to turn into chimetz. I want it in and out as fast as possible, so that it once obviously a matzah is baked, it can't become chimetz anymore. Now, when you have a dough which is thicker, that you find all over the Masechta, that something that's thicker is machmetz faster. And that's what they're saying. And this teretz, like I said, the Or L'Tzion saying, it's talking very gishmak azach. That's interesting. Also, this teretz, the chayr. Okay, that's not the ma'aser. I'll tell you, it's interesting. The Mishnah Berurah himself says that when the Rosh says miyad, the Rosh is maybe lav dafka. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah says efshir de miyad is lav dafka. Here, the Mishnah Berurah says it as an efshir. But it's interesting. I quoted for the oilim in the Marmakaimis. I'm not sure if the item got there. I did give a lot of Marmakaimis, but the Mishnah Berurah in a different siman, that's in one moment.
It's in Taf Sam. Can you go to the cover page? We'll tell you in a second.
Taf Sam Chalif, right?
I think Taf Sam Chalif. We'll tell you in a second. Go back to the
Yeah,
cover.
I also think it was in tough.
No, we have for you. Give us a second.
Yeah, it's in tough
Go back to the
time. Here the Mishnah Berurah says maybe it's something that takes time. Maybe it's more than just a second. And when the Rosh says miyad, everybody say all over halacha, when the poskim say the word la'alter and miyad, there's always a shaila what it means. What does it mean when the poskim say la'at? I'll give you an example. Everybody say by boirer, you have to do boirer for the upcoming Suda. Says the Shulchan Aruch, it has to be miyad, la'alter for the upcoming Suda. We know there, la'alter means something totally different. It definitely doesn't mean a second. It definitely doesn't mean 18 minutes. It depends what you're preparing. If you're preparing for a meal, which is 400 people, your la'alter is going to be a very long la'alter. It's going to be 400 minutes. If you're by la'alter by Kiddush, and if the other remembers, I'm sure the other remembers. When we learned Siman Reish Ayin Gimel, we learned that Kiddush b'Makom Suda has to be l'alter. One of the things is Kiddush b'Makom Suda in the place. One of the things is Kiddush b'Makom Suda. You have to have a certain Suda, the Zionist, etc. And then Kiddush b'Makom Suda meant that it had to be immediately with the Kiddush right away. Says the Ramah, l'alter, immediately the Suda. What's l'alter there? Does l'alter mean 1 second? Does it mean 10 seconds? So l'alter always you have to dan in the place you are. So here also, when we say the word miyad, said the Biur Halacha, maybe it doesn't mean immediately 1 second. Here he says as an afshir in the Biur Halacha in Tav Samach Aleph in Dibra Maskal V'Yeshel Zar, he says afilu lemad machmerinan in Tav Mem Tes, that if you make it that it's hot already, afilu b'pachas mimil, even less than a mil.
Tav Samach Aleph, Rabbi say on the screen, please.
Tav Samach Aleph.
We have it. We must have it. So let's go further.
Afilu b'pachas mishir mil. So he says, "Aval bikain pashit the shear kol shubainan." It has to have a shear. Uberega echas loitachnis. Here, the Mishnah Berurah says it with a much more confidence and severity that the rush does not mean it's machmitz miyad. He says it's a very interesting contrast.
Isn't it partial that it could be that it depends where you are in the process? I mean, if you're closer to the
timer, I'm going to get to that also. It could definitely be telling you that. It could definitely tell you that.
You're closer to the timer, you're closer to the fire, you're closer
yeah. We're going to get to that for sure. Absolutely. Okay. But over here, he's talking about that's in fact that I already started working on it with my hands. That's why this has created such a problem. But the Biur Halacha over there, his extremities are very extreme. He says, so therefore, it's for sure that it could become chametz in less than a mil, right? But then he writes, "Aval bikain pashit the shear kolshu," but you need a shear, right? Uberega echas not. So what is it? It's not 18 minutes and it's not 1 minute. So what exactly is it? What exactly is it? So it's interesting. The Lashon in the Biur Halacha here, he says, I'll read you a Lashon 1 second. He writes, "Vafilu b'pachas meshir mil, aval bikain pashit the shear kol shubainan." Now, everybody say, when I want to say like this, listen how I talk. When I want to say, it's for sure less than 18 minutes, but it's not a rega. So what is it? It's 30 seconds. I mean, there's a very big discrepancy between 18 minutes and 30 seconds, right? It would sound like that the Mishnah Berurah is giving you even more than 30 seconds and a minute. And he's saying, I agree, it's not it is pachas mimil, right? He probably doesn't mean it's 17 minutes and 16 minutes, but he also probably doesn't mean it's 30 seconds, because that wouldn't be the way you would say something. The way you would say something is you would say it's way less than 18 minutes. It's way less than that, right?
Where in the Halacha do we find anything else? Where do we find anything else besides 18 minutes or a second in this sugya? Where do we find it?
The Rosh here is saying a metzias, and he's learning it from all of these Gemaras, with all of their chumras of not doing it in the sun and not doing it in this and that, is that there's a certain hashkaf over here, an attitude that you have to make sure that you're doing your best, that it shouldn't become chimatz. 18 minutes, we only found in one place, when it's something that could potentially rise on its own. But once it's already hot, that's the chiddush of the Rosh, is that you have to, the metzias see. So again, let's make a sikkum. The Rosh seems to say that it's machmitz miyad once it has a certain amount of heat. To say the Rosh is computa miyad, the Biur Halacha is not willing to accept that. It's not like the Minhag Olam. And even the Rebbeinu Yerucham, the Talmud of the Rosh, is clearly not saying miyad, it's machmitz miyad. He's telling you, be careful, because it could be machmitz any moment. The examples we gave are the sketches on the matzah that the Rebbeinu Yerucham says you can't do because it takes time. And he says, but if you did it and you see it wasn't machmitz, it's not possible. The Rishonim clearly all had this minig that they would make the dough, and then after they make the dough, they wouldn't be Isaac and something else, but then they would go and set up the fire, which definitely took time. If it takes 18 minutes, you have problems. That for sure is a problem. So most Rishonim hold that once you worked on the dough, you get 18 minutes. The Rosh tells you you don't get 18 minutes. What you get, says the Biur Halacha, I don't know. It's less than 18 minutes, but it's not 1 second. What is it? A few seconds, a few minutes, who knows? Says the Or L'Tzion, and like I mentioned before, the Darkei Moshe, thin matzahs, and especially Ashkenazi matzahs, for sure, there's going to be a lot more leeway because it's very thin. It's much harder to be machmitz. Now, you go to the Chazon Ish, comes along, actually before the Chazon Ish, because the Chazon Ish says also what the Biur Halacha says, and the Graz says this also. The Biur Halacha and Dibra Matzah V'Achar says you should know, another idea in the Rosh is that the Rosh, and this is how the Baal Tanya learns in Sif Yud Aleph, the Rosh, he says, the Rosh is talking about when you know for sure it's hot. That's another thing. Now, I said today, in the matzah bakeries, the oilam doesn't use their hands really, right? Just by the kneader, they make it. The person, the fanemer, it's called in Yiddish, the person who kneads the dough. So then he uses his hands. But from that point, what goes on in the matzah bakery is they're using sticks, and usually they're metal sticks. You have the finner with that huge heavy stick, and that's a metal stick. And one of the reasons why they're using that is because metal is going to not be machmitz as fast. It's not going to heat it up as fast. And then the rolling pins are basically, in most of the, everywhere today, are metal. And most of the people are doing it either on paper or on metal sheets. So then you lost even the hands of the Rosh. More so, says the Biur Halacha, it's only if you see that it's cham. Maybe the Rosh only meant it's machmitz biyad if you see it's hot. Which as we get closer and closer to the oven, maybe when we're in the oven room about it, we're going to have to be very careful. Sometimes you take the person, he's holding the mat. That's why you need a good mashkiach. Sometimes the person is waiting to be machnis a matzah into the oven, and the other fellow's taking it out. And he's just standing there. He's standing here. Rabbi Yisai, look where I am. Here's the oven. He's standing right there with the stick, holding the matzah, right there by the oven. And he's waiting for the other guy to take. You know how hot it is there, Rabbi Yisai? Das is mamish fragnish. Das is a little bit more than a 60th of the Eish of Gehenim. And he's sitting there with a matzah that's been, forget if it's been worked on by its hands, but you're getting it hot for a different reason. That's a very serious shayla. Then it could be machmitz miyad. How do I know? Because the Messias, there's a velt here. The truth is, I should read you one more very important Mishnah Berurah here. Let's see. Okay, the Mishnah Berurah on Tafnun Test on this sif. It's Yud Aleph. This is the last Mishnah Berurah. Shulchan Aruch just said, don't leave it even for a minute because it could be machmitz miyad. It says in Mishnah Berurah, what's a loimer la'achar lisha? After, listen to the words in Mishnah Berurah. It's a very hard Mishnah Berurah by saying, la'achar lisha, after you needed it, don't leave it for a second. After you needed it, koidim shehischil la'arechaisa, before you let me read you from the beginning of this Mishnah Berurah. I'm sorry, but here. Mishnah Berurah says like this. It's all big Mishnah Berurahs here. Shulchan Aruch says like this. He says, don't leave it even for a second. Now, the Shulchan Aruch in the beginning was going when you didn't use your hands. That's the part that the Mishnah Berurah is explaining that you get 18 minutes. In a minute, the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain the part where you don't get 18 minutes and it's machmitz miyad, and whatever he explained is called miyad. But listen how the Mishnah Berurah explains how what is the point of when you do get the 18 minutes? Very important, Mishnah Berurah. After you needed it, that means I used my hands and I needed it. Mishnah Berurah says that's not what we're talking about. That part for sure you get 18 minutes. Before you started to make it into a flat matzah, basically a flat matzah. Says Mishnah Berurah, Avapi shaloi neschamama adayim b'mishnas yadayim. Avapi, sorry, shezgol arachayis. Avapi shaloi neschamama adayim b'mishnas yadayim harbe. In other words, Mishnah Berurah is coming to say Chumrah. He's coming to say, once I needed it, and not only did I need it, but I even rolled it into a dough. I was maskal to roll it into a dough, into a matzah, excuse me. He says, then don't leave it for 18 minutes. That's his chumrah. Don't leave it for 18 minutes because then it'll be machmetz. That's the case of where the Mishnah Berurah says Shraga. But that means, again, that means I rolled it out already and I still don't have to worry at that point because that's not called hot. Then afterward, the Mishnah Berurah and Sivkat in Yud Ches, so Mishnah Berurah, and even more so, Shartzi and Sivkat in Yud Beis, he says, after you eirich it, you made it into a flat piece of dough, then it'll be machmetz even faster, like we're going to say in a minute. That's what Mishnah Berurah we say in a minute. So now listen to Mishnah Berurah in a minute. So in Sivkat in Yud Ches, he says like this, Ulefizeh, listen to the warning the Mishnah Berurah brings. Ulefizeh, tzarich lizar ma'oid, la'achar she'archoi v'ridda matzah. What's ridida matzah? Right? What they do is they went and they flattened it out the gamre. He says, after you finished flattening out the gamre, and they put it by the menaker, they give it to the radler. The radler, I don't think there's an English word for a radler, but I say, what's a radler? Right? The guy who makes the holes inside the matzah. Sheinaker miyad. When you pass it to the radler, you make sure he does it miyad. And he says, and not only that, he should not stop making the holes. Why? Because Kevin Shalachashin is asking, you already worked on it. So he says, from that point, once you worked on it, so now it could be machmetz. And then he writes, Va'oilam ein nizarim bekach. People aren't careful. And that's when he brings down, like I mentioned, the Mishnah Berurah says that miyad is lav dafka. Now, but this Mishnah Berurah is very important. From the point of when the dough goes from the kneader until it gets to the radler, until it gets to that point, the Mishnah Berurah is not warning. He doesn't warn about all of that time. From the point of the kneading all the way to the radler, the Mishnah Berurah says nothing. It sounds like there he's not even worried about the rush. It sounds like that's not enough of an ASIC. The only time is that now, once I finished and I made it into a flattened dough, now already you put your hands and you made it into a flattened dough and whatnot. So now it was oisik and oisik and oisik. Now it can be machmetz miyad. So the advice, again, you have to keep this in mind. You go to a matzah factory, you go to a matzah bakery. You have to know that until the point, first of all, like I keep on saying, all the Rishonim were basically mekel. Second of all, the rush probably means that it could be machmetz miyad. Third of all, it's only a problem if you see it that it got hot, it got warm, etc. Fourth of all, in our Metzias today, we use metal, rolling pins, etc. It's not even being machmetz al yedei yad. Okay. Then you have another cheshbon. Our matzahs are very, very thin. Now, the most cheshbon, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't even warn and get nervous until which point? Until the point of where it's flat legamre and you're putting it in front of the person who's doing the holes. Meaning until that point, that's not enough ASIC. So now it's true. Once you get to that point, okay, now you should be ASIC the whole time. All the time. And like I said before, you certainly shouldn't allow that he gets it closer to the tunner because that's far, far worse than what it says in the Gemara, that he shouldn't be lush in the sun. That's obviously much worse than even the sun. That's what I say. That's part one. And this is why the Chsanish and the Bialacha basically Kemat all seem to say that you don't have to worry about this b'diavad. We do what we can at the Matzah Bakery. We try to make it as quick as possible. It's clear. And but Akopanim, b'diavad, there's no shaila that the matzahs are kosher. Now the Maisa, what about what I mentioned before by the machine matzahs? That I told you before that you go into a machine matzah factory and you're going to see that it lies on a conveyor belt for a while. So again, let's see. Lefi, all the Rishonim, sure, not a problem, even if they were using their hands. Now, even Lefi the Rosh, no hands were being used. So we don't necessarily have it hot. So now I just have to know what's the Metzias. At that point, before it gets into the oven, so most machine factories that have obviously a good hechsher are going to make sure that the area is cold. Now, as it's traveling, okay, we have no reason to believe it's hot. And it wasn't even touched by hands. Like I said before, it could be it's worse if they go and they actually press it with their hands. The amount of time, when I was in the machine matzah factory, the amount of time that it sat was not exactly like it's being, without any ASIC, is not exactly, it's not 5 minutes, it's not 4 minutes, it's not 3 minutes, it's not 2 minutes. It could be about a minute and a half sometimes. But let's see what you're seeing over here. Since it's thin matzahs, you're seeing that the Darkei Moshe allowed it. And the Rosh himself says the Mishnah Berurah is Lav Dafka. And like I mentioned before, Lav Dafka was somewhere between 18 and a rega. So with all this together, if somebody eats machine matzahs, he doesn't have to worry. Another Nekuda Abayisai is now you can appreciate a little bit more what exactly is what we call the 18 minutes. Now, it's very interesting. I tell you, Abayisai, there's chumras and chumras and chumras. You have to understand what's going on over here. What we call 18-minute matzah, Abayisai, is not 18-minute matzah. What we call 18-minute matzah is about 6-minute matzah or 7-minute matzah. It ain't 18-minute matzahs. Right? And sometimes you're in a matzah bakery and they're selling after chai. The matzah that we're after chai, and the person says, "Well, I'm a shishi. I don't eat after chai matzahs. I don't eat after 18-minute matzahs." You have to understand what it means when they're saying after 18-minute matzahs today, generally. Now, again, there's different achsherim, and there's different chaburas, and there's different chumras. I'm just going to give you a little bit of concepts over here to appreciate. There were all through the Doiris different anhagas. Yeah, here I brought the Marmakaimus. I'm not sure if they got there. There's a Mogen Avram that talked about washing hands and cleaning up mamish in between. Each time you had a Myra, each and every dough, they stopped and they cleaned and they washed their hands. That's a big chumrah. The Chayk Yankiv says the Minhag Olam is not like that. What goes on today? What goes on today is very interesting. The kneader, the fanemer, he gets the dough, he gets the water. Now listen closely. By the true machmirim and the very, very chumratik echsherim, for example, they start counting the 18 minutes. Watch this. They pour in the water, you pour in the flour the first time. They start counting 18 minutes. Now, I'm going to tell you the secret. He does the kneading. It takes a minute. He goes and he beats it with the finner. It takes another minute and a half, whatever, 2 minutes. He takes that piece, which is now a ganze dough. He chops it up. It takes a few seconds. He puts it onto the table. They pass out the pieces. They roll it in. Okay. By the time that dough, which was 4 minutes ago, was inside the kneading bowl, by the time it gets to the oven, it takes about 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the most 6, 7 minutes, something like that, depending on the matzah bakery, depending on the island, whatever. And from there into the thing, it's 7 minutes. It has been worked on the whole time. This is no shaila, according to anybody. More so, if they would continue doing this and continue doing this and continue doing this, HaRav, we said, if you work on it all day, it's never machmitz. Even the rush that says if you stop for a second, it's leinit natar l'malach esharis. So technically, if you would be doing this and constantly doing this, you could be doing this not for 7 minutes, but 700 minutes. Now, what does it mean when they say 18 minutes? They mean from when the flour went in and the water, they count now 18 minutes. After 18 minutes, that, and again, these matzahs went into the oven. Then I take a new kneading bowl and I knead in there and I send that one out. And usually you're able to get between 2 and 3 rounds. It depends on the matzah bakery. So don't take as a halacha mashmi sinai, take the concept right now. You get 2 or 3 rounds, and then this last matzah is now on my clock going in after 18 minutes. Now, but I think for a minute. Technically, the matzahs could be going for the next 18 hours, and we're okay because we're constantly working. So what's the number 18 minutes? This is a chumrah that we're afraid, who knows, maybe there's a piece of dough on the table that just sat there while they're working and it flanged to the side. You know what goes on. So that piece of dough, nobody's working on it. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe there's another piece of dough, and maybe there's a piece of dough in my nail, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now when I'm going to get that next dough, that dough. So now once 18 minutes have gone by, so that there's a piece of dough and that's going to go into my matzah, which would probably be bottled anyways, because it's before Pesach bottle. Okay. But Rabbi say, so now you understand the chumrah, but you don't yet, because it's still very difficult to understand this chumrah. Rabbi say, so then why am I starting the 18 minutes from the kneading bowl? Maybe I should start the 18 minutes 2 minutes later, once it gets to the table, or okay, or at least what we should do is every single kli should get 18 minutes from when it started working, right? The kneading bowl should get 18 minutes from when it started. The finner table should get 18, and that, which would extend us, Rabbi Yisai, about 3 minutes, 4 minutes, etc. Nope. Okay. Plus, don't forget, this is all big chumras, because also in the matzah bakery, they're walking around and they are sweeping off the table, making sure there's no bits that are getting attached. You put this all together, plus don't forget I told
falls on
you.
the floor, we don't care, right? It falls on the floor. Why do we care? We don't care if it falls on the floor because it's not going to end up on the matzah. That's the point.
Yeah, if it ends up on the floor, that we don't bother us. Maybe on Erev Pesach matzahs, you might have a different issue because it's already a shas habir. But now, Abaisai, don't forget there's another chumrah going on here. 18 minutes is also chumrah. The Mishnah Berurah brings over here from the Chassam Sofer and Tafnan Test, the Chassam Sofer and Mishnah Berurah brings that maybe a mill is 22 and a half minutes and maybe it's 24 minutes. So you can say, yeah, but we don't hold like that. First of all, Mishnah Berurah does hold like that, but the evident matzah, which shows you how much credence he gives that shita. But more so, Abaisai, we're talking about a chumrah and a chumras. We're talking about a chumrah that's not based the etzem on halacha. So now I can be mitzaref the shita of 24 and whatnot. So now, Abaisai, let's think about it for a second. They tell you they're selling you after chai matzahs. So the person thinks to himself, wow, this matzah is after chai. It probably grew and shemesh shemayim. It got bigger and bigger, and it's probably like a challah. Who would eat such a thing? Abaisai, think about it. The matzah that's after chai is mutter gomer 100%, according to all the poskim that ever lived and ever will live, without any shaila. Because again, they've been oisik the whole entire time. They've been constantly oisik. The table itself, it's not 18 minutes. When they say 18 minutes, they mean from there to there. But this table, it's only been 14 minutes. And it doesn't mean 14 minutes. It means the potential of maybe there's a dot on the table that's out there for 14 minutes. So it doesn't even mean 18 minutes. So therefore, if the after 18-minute matzah, somebody can't afford, you have to know, after 18 minutes, not so pashut. But again, I'm just trying to give today concepts. Avada, Bnei Yisrael, is to be machmer as much as possible. So Avada, the Beis HaLevi, there was Yadua, he would only eat one kazayis the whole ganze Pesach because he had such a nerve and bachad. Right? Other people fakir, they eat matzah and matzah and matzah. Everybody, kulam, they're all libam l'shamayim, kulam l'shem shamayim niskavnu. This one's being more machmer. This one's being more machmer on the eating of the matzah. This is what I say. I to give you, to end this part, a little bit of that Horace. When I'm in my matzah chabura, so I give, I'm usually in charge of the oven room. The oven room also, you have to know about kfulas. You have to know that in our matzahs, the kfulas are also a bit of a chumrah because they're very thin matzahs, but everyone knows here, we have our chumras. I just want to tell you some of the hanhagas based today, what the chumras we do. First of all, we tell everybody that comes in there to cut his nails so that we have less potential of dough getting stuck. And then we wash the hands. Every 18 minutes, they wash the kalim and the hands because like we saw, that we don't want the hands being hot. So there were those that had ideas maybe to have gloves. Wouldn't that be better? The answer is absolutely not, because gloves make your hand very hot. Who remembers in the first days of Corona when people wore gloves? They made your hands very, very hot. And your hands are getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Terrible. We want you washing your hands every 18 minutes so that your hands aren't hot. Because even though I said you use a rolling pin, but avada mold, you do. Next warns the Mishnah Berurah, don't sit there and just rub the dough. Rubbing the dough is just making it nice and hot. Don't rub the dough. You want to work on it. Okay. Next, the only good thing that came out of Corona was a lot of those workers, they wore masks. So Mela, they couldn't talk and smoke and spit and everything because the May Paris. Don't forget, the roik has the ability to be machmitz, the matzah, and the talking, and a cigarette, chalila, the fire can go a little bit of an ash, and it can make it get hotter. Okay, so therefore, they shouldn't be talking that much. If you see they're schwitzing, give them a headband, because we don't want that. That's zayah, and zayah, like may Paris, it could cause it to be machmitz even faster. We are very careful. The most biggest shtus in the history, mamish, the biggest shtus that ever came out of any guy's mouth was the gansa alilas dam. You see, it was all from the Helik of Bashefer, that there's blood in the matzah. There can't be a bigger shtus. The one thing we're so scared of in the matzah chabur is if you see one of the guys and he has blood on his hand, we're terrified because the blood can go in and the blood is May Paris, and May Paris causes something to be machmitz even faster. Shtus, all from the Shemayim. That anybody ever believes such a narishkeit. And we're careful, like I mentioned. We're careful, obviously, l'shem matzis mitzvah. More so, you got to be careful. The child says he's 13 years old, he's a bar mitzvah bacher, very nice. But in Simon Tav Samech, it talks about that he has to be a gadol. And we're not saimach on the chazak of the Rava when it comes to deraises. Over here, we're dealing with the shema. We need deraises. Now, the Maisa, if he's not dealing with the kneading and he's just dealing with maybe rolling something that didn't need to be done anyways, and there's a gadol oimid al gabav, and it's he's telling you he is a gadol. No. So maybe b'diavad the matzah is okay, but we don't do these things. The chatchila, we need to know he's a gadol. Once he has hair on top, a few pricks around on his beard, then we know that lamata he also has. But again, is certainly the washing the hands is very important, that it should be cold. And the ikar, excuse me, the ikar is to make sure not to excuse me, not to get into any machloikis when you're making the matzahs. What's a famous story? They say that there was once a tzaddik that he walked into a matzah bakery and he said, "Ich esse nicht die matzahs." Sagt er, "Was nicht?" Sagt er, "In die matzahs du blood. There's blood in these matzahs." Sagt er, "Blood in the matzahs? Well, that's the blood. There's no blood in the matzahs." He said, "Over here, there was a child that came in, right? And the kid was looking around and they screamed at him, 'Hey, what do you think this is?' Him, right? And the kid worked out all upset and all sad. Said, "Do blood in the matzahs, blood in the matzahs." Talk upon him. The ikar is, Rabbi say, is to do it with a geschmack and to do it with a simcha. And you show this to a child, you bring him to a matzah bakery and you explain to him what's going on, and you explain to him this reasons. We have chumras and chumras and chumras. We're so scared of a dat of chometz. We're machmer on something that be'etzim is no shaila. From the point it went from the bowl into the oven, it took 6 minutes and it was constant work, and we could do this for 20 hours. But if we would even hear the word 18 chai, we wouldn't give the guy an aliyah in a shul. So the ikar is to do it with a geschmack and a simcha, and to give it over to the ba'aznei bincha, ba'aznei ben bincha. As Hashem, what's the next sugya, Reb Shlomo?
Well, we were going to do a matzah and mar, but we got so into matzah that I don't know how much time is left to be marred. So it'll probably be something in matzah. If I can ask the Rav Matriach to discuss this on the phone, I would appreciate it. So we can
discuss on the phone.
Yeah, we'll discuss. You'll tell me what you want to say.
Okay. When you say matzah, you mean even the eating matzah?
No? As you said correctly, we like to do the hard sugyas. That the week before Yontif, the plan is to do mitzvahs haseder halacha l'maisa. So my team that week before. I'm also, I don't know if I can do this in public, but last year the Rav was incredible to us and gave us this year in Chalamoid. You'll have to tell me what your family situation will be in that week if it's shayach, and then we have to. So that's the week before Yontif. If it's shayach,
that means we have another week. We have an extra week next week.
We have next week, the week before Yontif. Then we have Chalamoid. Those are the three things, and then we give you a week off. So the Benizmanim. So we need next week. We'll discuss this on the phone. The week after should be Mitzvah Halayla, obviously, and then Chalamoid, whatever you want, if you can do it.
Great. Derech Agav, I'm flexible next week. It doesn't have to be Wednesday because I'm off anyways from the Koilim. Next week, it makes no difference to me. I'll see Wednesday unless.
So we don't ever take off. We don't take off.
No, there's no games. There's no games.
We learn Erev Yontif, Erev Shabbos, everything. So it's a regular week for us. Need a little bit of time off. Okay. I'll be in touch with you on the phone. Rabbi Sai, tonight the Chadarsha will be a half hour later. I indulge everybody, ask Mechila, it'll be at 8:30 and not at 8. I'll tell you again to try to Sakam everything you heard today. And in the course of the last week and a half on Bafiat, Matzais, maybe we'll just find another video too if we haven't yet shown. That's at 8:30 tonight, 8:30 tonight. And then tomorrow at 11 o'clock, Rabbi Zucker is going to talk about Lishma and Matzis and other related issues. I'll see everybody tonight at 8:30, tomorrow at 11. Have a good day.